In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the networking fundamentals in Python programming. Some of the topics that we'll cover in this lesson are programming in Python. We'll talk about the client-server model. And importantly, we'll dive into the sockets programming in Python. And of course, I'll also mention the TCP/IP basic protocol suite. So just a few words on the client-server model. Networking is a huge field, so we will stick to the core concepts that are important for Python programming. The networking is the concept of two programs basically communicating across a network, whether it be from the client to client or client to server, or even the client to itself. So the client is basically an end device interfacing with a human, and the server is the device providing a service for various clients. The most common is, in fact, the client-server model. Clients connect into the server to get information they require, and they can use the web browser to do that. For example, they can connect to the Google website, which in turn is basically a server. The transmission control protocol, internet protocol, is basically TCP/IP. The address, for example, could be 127.0.0.1, which is in fact is the local host of your computer. The port number can be any, for example, 5000, 5200, 5010, and so on. Typically, port numbers ranging from 1 to 1024 are reserved for core protocols, so we try to use something above 1024, but below the 65,535, which is the maximum. Sockets are the programming abstractions for connections. They allow us to communicate in a bidirectional manner. Once they're connected or ready to transmit, we can then use them to send data and receive data. They implement the most common transport protocols, TCP, or they can also use the UDP protocol as well. So the idea about sockets is that in Python, for example, using code, we will create a host name and a TCP port number and allow the server and the client to connect to each other. And I'll demonstrate that, of course. Various socket methods that we can use in Python programming are listed. For instance, we can create the basic socket method, be the constructor that creates a new socket. Then we can bind the socket with the host name and the port. Once it's bound, it's going to start listening, and then we can also use other methods such as accept, which would accept a new connection when found. Similarly, once you specify the host name and port, you can also use additional methods such as the receive buffer, send the bytes, and closing the connection, and so on. So let's begin our code. I'm going to first demonstrate how to create the code for setting up our server, and then I'll set up the code for our client end, and I'll demonstrate how the client connects to the server using Python. So here our Sublime editor is open. I'm going to go ahead and begin our code for the server first. So I'm going to make sure that our server is set up first. In other words, we'll set up the host name and the port number as well before we establish our client. So let me go ahead and put a comment here first. This is for the server, and also quickly save this as well. So we're going to call it myserver.py, and next just do the from socket import everything, and then I'm also going to import time. So from time import current time, and that's optional, by the way. Otherwise I can just use the socket import. If I need to display time to the client, I could use this as well. And next I can also do the threading, import thread. Let's begin our class next. So this will be the client handler, and it'll be thread. And what this would do is it simply handles a client request. Next we do the definitions. So def init for self and the client. Specify the thread.init for self, and then for the self client as well. So self client would equal the client. My next definition would be to run. So def run the self, and then specify the client self dot underscore client dot send, and just the bytes. And I can also display the C time, and that's again optional. So let's do the C underscore time and then add the text to it. So I'm going to say have a nice day, and the format I'm going to use would be, let's say, ASCII, and next would be the self.client.close. Great. So once I've specified my class and a couple of definitions, next I'm going to specify or set the host. So my host is going to be the local host, and the port number again could be any. I'm going to use, let's say, 15201, and my buffer size, so it'll be buff size equals 1024, and the address would equal the host and the port. Once I've specified these, I'm going to continue to say server equals socket, and then specify the attributes. I'm going to say AF underscore inet, comma, sock stream. So once I've set my variable, of course I need to bind it as well. So let's do server bind to the address. And next, I'm also going to have the server listen. So do server.listen for 5. Great. And at this point, the server is just going to wait for the connection from clients, right? It's going to keep listening. And as soon as the client connects to the port 15201 to the local host, it's going to display the message, have a nice day. That's the idea. So let me in fact scroll down here, put some comments so it's easier. So the server at this point, the server now just waits for connections. And also, I'm going to put another comment here, and hands over sockets to client handlers, right? All right, so let's do a while true. Let's go ahead and print waiting for connection. And once I print this out, I'm going to make sure I specify the client address equals to the server accept method, and then print again. So this time I'm going to print and say ... connected from, and then specify the address. Set my handler equal to client handler for the client, and then start it. So handler.start. Perfect. So this is our code for the server. So just for understanding purposes, we specify the class, set up our host name, provided a port number. A word of caution here is, for example, if you're using Windows or Mac or any other operating system, make sure your Windows firewall has a rule built in if you're not able to connect to this port, to the local host. And you can, of course, change these ports as well. And let's correct spelling here. So it's socket, not ST. Great. Perfect. So I'm going to save it and let's run it. Python is going to build it and should display a message waiting for connection. Great. So now we've set this server up, right? So this is for the server. We've set that up. Next, I'm going to create a new file, Python file for the client, and have the client try to connect to the port number 15201. So let's go ahead and create a new file. Control N for the new file. Let me save it and call it myclientserver.py. In fact, it is just a client. I'm just naming it. So put a comment. This is for the client testing. Let me go ahead and import socket. And again, this imports the socket module. Just a comment. Get my variable in here. S equals socket dot socket with a set of parentheses, and this creates the object. So let me go ahead and put that also. So create a socket object, specify my host equals localhost, and then my port equals I believe it was 15201. Let's verify. Let's go back to our other code, and it's 15201. Great. So let's go back. Once the port is specified, let's connect. So s.connect to the host and the port, and print a message if it is successfully connected. So my print would be s.receive 1024, and then I'm going to close it. So s.close, and what this does is simply closes the socket when done. Great. Let me go ahead and save it and run it. So once you run this, you'll get a successful message on the bottom, says have a nice day, and you've established a successful connection with the server at port number 15201, and your host is localhost. Now, a word of caution here that sometimes these port numbers do not run in the first instance. You may need to change these port number at the client and going back to the server as well. So as long as they match, you should have a successful connection between the server and your client. So this way you can practice creating the server socket and then creating a client end and trying to connect to the port numbers. And once the connection is successful, you can implement this methodology in your other programs as well. So I hope this helps practice, and let's move to the next lesson.